everybody for another educational lesson. My name is Francisco, and I'm here from beautiful Hawaii. So, today we're going to talk about America. And when we look at America, we see how it's actually the old world and not the new world. And that stories of Atlantis come from the region of America prior to the cataclysm of the Great Flood. And that we see that the oldest pyramids and temples, when we see they are in America, when we see Sumerian culture, which we say is the oldest civilization after the flood, we see the oldest writings of Sumeria in America, the oldest artifacts in America. So when we look at America, we can also see that people who we call people of the Bible, which would be known today as Hebrews, the specific people called the Hebrews, and we consider the stories the Canaanites, Cain's children, the Chinook Indians. We see all of them have a history in this side of the world. And if we look at the actual identity of the people, then we link them with their descendants today, meaning the Austronesian, Melanesian, Polynesian types throughout Oceania, and the African American, Aboriginal, Mexicans, indigenous people throughout America. And we see how like the Chinook Indians in Canada, how these people represent the dynamics of what we consider America today. And that much of the people who we consider those people have been disassociated with this side of the world and have been sold a story of coming from Asia, coming from Africa, in order to remove your right as an Aborigine or original people of these lands. So if we consider that to be true, and we consider America to be the middle of the earth, and we consider these specific lands in the books, which we call, the Bible or Torah, or all of these different traditions and stories from other kingdoms, then we have to realize that if this is the middle of the world and these things happen here, then other nations had to have been here, like the Romans, right? And when we see the Romans, we consider them to be European, but we don't have a grasp of history and how the Romans became what we consider them today. Caucasoid people, who we call European, of the barbarian tribes of Gog and Magog. So when you look further back into the history, the Romans appear more Austronesian, more African American, what we consider Negro. So if we consider them to be Negro, we consider a lot of these, we have to reconsider all of these different kingdoms and civilizations which we think, is this way or that way. Because if you go into history and you realize that it surely didn't start off that way. And a lot of times there was a mix of populations, like sort of like today, where we get into these kingdoms where trade is involved, mass commerce, and then an influx of many people, and we get like a sort of Babylonian kind of city. And this has happened many times, and we can understand that this has happened in Rome. So when we look in history, they always talk about barbarians who came and assaulted Rome, and even at times conquered Rome. So I'm gonna show how they conquered Rome, and this is them telling the story of how they became Rome in our eyes. So fighting had ensued. Whatever happened had happened. I believe that Black Rome and them had negotiations all the way up to colonization. And that all the way up to the Civil War, that was the last confrontation between the existence of what was the greatest empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and into it from its beginning until then, which would be considered a time where they lost a lot of their power and support. So if we look at history, they tell us that the barbarians were on a rampage throughout Europe to conquer Roman, Christian, Catholic kingdoms. And they went throughout Europe and did this, right? So how far-fetched would it be to say that these kingdoms existed still yet during colonization, and they had a hand in the colonization, in which they used these barbarians or these prisoners of war, and they used them to go to war with us, eventually being usurped by these people throughout the revolutions, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the American Revolution, all these different revolutions, was the existing power structure of Rome, who ruled by the sword, and the placement or the leveling up of what we would be considering the barbarians, who we consider the Europeans today. So if you look in this book, it goes, this is the Maccabees. Maccabees is really interesting. It tells you, if you were to consider that Maccabees happened in America, and that who we consider Alexander the Great came to America, and they had warred with tribal nations in America and had placed on them specific traditions and customs in order for them to follow a certain guideline and to reframe or go against their prior traditions. So they cemented this, and through barbary tactics You know, they set police type officials within the kingdoms, and they oversaw these rituals and customs. And if they weren't being executed properly, then they would in turn be either killed, or some type of torture was done in order for others to follow through. Okay, so this book tells about it and how there's treaties that ensued, and how specific populations of us or tribes within our tribe was area, which would be considered the Pacific Ocean and America, allied with the who we calling the Greeks, the Coptics, and they in turn went out and did the deeds of these people. And we can, if we wanted to take that as a fact, then we could correlate it with some of our traditions, like how a people group came from 2,000 miles away from Hawaii. And let's just say, where's 2,000 miles away? We're going to consider that the only two options would be Tahiti and America. So they would the option that the institution, the mainstream scholarship would choose would be, okay, well, it has to be Tahiti. But if we're going to expand on it and, you know, open our horizons and just entertain the idea to say that, well, maybe during the westerly winds, it's not, you know what I mean, that this could happen. We could have relations to America, rather than having us believe that we're right 2,000 miles away from America, but we came from Africa on the other side of the world, and we never was able to reach America. At the same time, they shoot themselves in the foot, saying that, oh, there's old bones of Polynesians, that we got sweet potato from America, right? In which when you learn in history, much of the food that we have in the world has had its origin in America, as well as many different animals. Saying, let's say, the camel. The camel had all its origin in America. The two oldest genomes of camel came from America, which one of them created the camels we love so dear in the Middle East or Africa, right? So what we fail to realize is that they deliberately do these things. So we can see in Hawaii, someone came, did not say Tahiti, they said Kahiko, they said 2,000 miles away. So let's say they were in America, perverted by the Greeks, Coptics, which there is many evidence of Greeks in North America. The Mormons provide a lot of research and artifacts concerning this. Individual archaeologists and treasure hunters can attest and show proof to this. We have newspaper reports of these artifacts, whether Egyptian, Roman, Greek, all these different things being found in America. Tradition of smelting that has been not educated to us in our education system. So what if these people were perverted, came to Hawaii and started to weed into culture some of the other traditions and customs? Because when we read in Hawaii's culture before the 1200s, who was the god of the agriculture and not necessarily the god of war. And that we really didn't worship idols prior to 1200s. And along with many other things that we have come to agree that is cultural in Hawaii, but is actually more to it in the history of my ancestors. So that's what this book speaks about. And this talks about the uprising of us against these groups and how we extracted them out of our communities eventually. And this tells about the struggle. But this, when I read chapter 8 of the first book of Maccabees, it goes, "Now Judas had heard of the fame of the Romans, that they were mighty and valiant men." And now when we look at the name Romans, there's also another name that's tied to it. Because of trickery. See, a lot of kingdoms had their history rewritten, whether it was by them or whether it was by newer populations who acquired the kingdoms. Their history was rewritten, and so to prevent us from finding a lot of the history, their name was changed from Idumea, or Idumeans to Romans. Okay, so Edom, Edessa, Idumea, Esau, all of these are nation names that's connected to who we consider Rome. And if we look at the Choctaw, a lot of these different Indian types, they have a family history of the name Esau, and it's also the name of their nation as a whole. And I have met a few Choctaw, and they're really good people, but as you can see in the forearm here is really long on a lot of it. And if we look in history, we know that during the history of American Indians, our ancestors had been attacked and reduced at times. So at times we allied and we incorporated many different tribes into a tribe. So, and also when we made it, especially in more modern times, mating wasn't our number one priority like it used to be. So today we may have a couple phenotypes within our family structure, but that's just because the males who had been chosen through matrimony and the offspring may have had several tribes within this family group. So that's why you see a lot of similarities between the families, but sometimes you might see some differences. And you'll see this with a lot of mixed families, or people who mate with people outside of their respective towns or states. So here we go. Now Judas has heard of the fame of the Romans, that they were mighty and valiant men, and such would lovingly accept all that joined themselves unto them, and make a league of amity with all that came unto them, and that they were men of great valor. It was told him also of their wars and noble acts which they had done among the Galatians, and how they had conquered them and brought them under their tribute, and what they had done in the country of Spain for the winning of the mines of the silver and gold which is there, and that by their policy and patience they had conquered all the place, though it were very far from them, and that the kings also came against from the uttermost part of the earth, till they had discomfited them. So if you read here, it's talking about the Galatians. And if we look at the Galatians, we see how, let's do it. So you look at Galatians, and then you look up the word. And if you look up Gaul, then Gaul was a historic region of Western Europe during the Iron Age that was inhabited by Celtic tribes. Now, encompassing present-day France, Luxembourg, Belgium, most of Switzerland, parts of northern Italy, as well as parts of Netherlands and Germany on the west bank of the Rhine. So now, if you look in history, you see that Benjamin Franklin said that all of these nations are swarthy. If you look in the French Supreme Court, it'll show you that two people had gone to the Supreme Court in that respective country fighting against an association that was offended by their lyrics and their writings in their books, which said that white people are colonizers of France and not the indigenous or aboriginal people. So in this court case, they won this court case, proving that white people are not aboriginal to France. And if you look in history, you see that the 10 tribes of the barbarians, the Franks, one of them were called the Franks, and they are the ones who came into Gaul and intermingled or usurped or lived with the Gaul people who were swarthy, and eventually became the French people we know today. They're called the Franks. That's why when you look in history, they always say, "Oh, the French," and then sometimes they say the Franks, and it's not justified because sometimes when they use the word Franks, they're not saying that, okay, this is the barbarian people. At times they are, but at times when they're talking about Aboriginal French, they'll still use and throw you off using the Franks term, when actually the Franks are the newer population who had moved in, was allowed to take towns and regions to farm and live, and eventually yearn for more, and through conquest was able to get at what they have today, which is all of France. So you can see this in like the movie, the TV show Vikings, how Athelstan and how these kingdoms in Europe negotiated with barbarians who we call Vikings. So if you look at in history, Athelstan is a real person, and the reason why they spelt his name A-E Thelstan was because this was a Greek way of determining or verify, telling that this person was of an Afro population. They were what we consider the Europeans to be today. They were of Austronesian, Melanesian, African American type, Iberian, Etruscans, these types of populations which we consider black, or like Polynesian, oceanic type. So, according to the testimony of Julius Caesar, Gaul was divided into 3 parts: Gallia, Celtica, Belgica, and Aquitania. Archaeologically, The Gauls were bearers of the Latine culture, which extends across all Gaul as well as East Horatia, Noricum, Pannonia, and southwestern Germania. During the 5th to 1st century BC, during the 2nd and 1st century BC, Gaul fell under Roman rule. Gallia Cisalpina was conquered in 203 BC and Gallia Narbinus in 123 BC. Gaul was invaded at 120 by the Cimbri and Teutons, who were in turn defeated by the Romans by 103 BC. Julius Caesar's family subdued the remaining parts of Gaul in his campaigns of 58 to 51 BC. Roman control lasted for 5 centuries until the last Roman rump state, the domain of Soissons, fell to the Franks. So here we go. Exactly what I was talking about, how these barbarian tribes were over here in competition with other black tribes of the original Gauls, who was replaced by the Franks and now called the French. And then you have this superpower of black Romans coming in trying to subdue both people. While the Celtic Gauls had lost their original identity and language. So here you go, you got these black Celtic Gauls had a tradition, an identity, and a language. And when these barbarian Franks come in, now this original identity and language is lost because, like Hawaii, when they came in, they demonized your language, told you to not speak it, and then ended up changing and perverting your language. And then eventually, when you came back to your language, now it's almost a lost thing where they expect it or they wanted it to be like that. But then it backfired. Now we're learning it, and we're able to see the perversions that were created, and also see what our ancestors had tried to tell us subliminally through the differences in the different cultures. Becoming amalgamated into Gallo-Roman culture, Gallia remained the conventional name of the territory throughout the early Middle Ages, until it acquired a new identity as the Capitan Kingdom of France in the High Medieval period. Gallia remains a name of France in modern Greek and modern Latin. The Greeks and Latin names Galatia, first attested by Timaeus in the 4th century BC, and Gallia are ultimately derived from a Celtic ethnic term or clan, Gal. The Galli or Gallia Celtic were reported to refer to themselves as Celtae by Caesar. Hellenistic folk etymology connected the name of the Galatians to the supposed milky white skin of the Gauls. Modern researchers say it is related to the Welsh, Cornish capacity, power, thus meaning powerful people. So this meant powerful people. This meant Welsh. We see by Benjamin Franklin that Welsh meant swarthy. Meant Welsh were the most swarthy of the people, right? They were the Gauls, meaning the clan, right? They were a clan. Then they got replaced, right? And they became known as Galatians or Galatai, right? So when modernly the people of Rome, the priests of Rome, do the New Testament, do the conquer